Nobody wanted to buy the mangy dog that morning at the livestock market, but what they didn't know was that this worthless-looking animal would soon make one desperate man richer than he'd ever dreamed possible. Thorn Shepherd stood at the edge of the dusty market square, counting the few coins left in his weathered pocket. The morning sun beat down mercilessly as merchants hawked their finest cattle and horses to wealthy ranchers. Sweat dripped from his brow as he watched deal after deal slip through his fingers, each animal selling for more money than he'd seen in months. His ranch was 3 days away from foreclosure. The bank had made that crystal clear when they'd visited last week, their cold eyes surveying his dying cattle and empty fields. Everything he'd built, everything his father had left him, would be gone unless he found a way to turn his luck around. But with only a handful of silver coins and mounting debts, hope seemed as distant as the mountains on the horizon. That's when he spotted Cassidy Flynn in the corner of the market, trying desperately to sell something that barely resembled a dog. The animal was thin, its coat patchy and dull, with ribs showing through matted fur. Copper sat listlessly beside Flynn, who kept shouting about the dog's supposed hunting abilities to anyone who would listen. But the crowd moved past without a second glance, some even covering their noses, as if the poor creature carried disease. Thorn watched as Flynn's asking price dropped from $20 to $15, then to $10, $2. Still, no buyers approached. The humiliation was written across Flynn's face as he grew more desperate with each rejection. Other merchants snickered and whispered among themselves, pointing at the pathetic scene unfolding in the corner. But something stirred in Thorn's chest as he observed the dog more closely. Despite its wretched appearance, Copper's eyes held an intelligence that seemed almost human. The way the animal watched the crowd, alert and calculating, suggested there was more beneath that sorry exterior than anyone realized. When Flynn's price hit $5, Thorn felt his pulse quicken. It was nearly all the money he had left, but something deep in his gut told him this might be his only chance. He approached slowly, his boots crunching on the dusty ground, while Flynn looked up with a mixture of hope and embarrassment. "That dog looks half dead," Thorn said, crouching down to get a better look at Copper. Flynn's shoulders sagged. "He's just been through a rough patch, mister. Good breeding stock, though. His daddy was the finest hunting dog this side of the territory." The words rang hollow, and both men knew it. But as Thorn extended his hand toward Copper, something unexpected happened. The dog's tail gave the faintest wag, and those intelligent eyes locked onto his with an intensity that made his breath catch. But what Thorn couldn't see coming was how this single decision would set in motion events that would change not just his fortune, but the entire course of his life. Thorn pulled out his last 5 silver coins, feeling their weight in his palm like the final remnants of his dignity. The metal felt cold against his skin as he realized he was about to gamble everything on what looked like the worst investment of his life. "I'll take him," he said quietly, extending the coins toward Flynn. Cassidy Flynn's eyes widened with disbelief and relief. He snatched the money so quickly that Thorn wondered if the man thought he might change his mind. Around them, other merchants had begun to notice the transaction, and their laughter started low, but grew louder as word spread that someone had actually bought Flynn's worthless dog. "You just threw your money away, friend," called out Virgil Claymore, the territory's wealthiest cattle dealer. His booming voice carried across the market as he approached with his entourage of buyers. Claymore's expensive clothes and polished boots marked him as a man who'd never known a day of real struggle. "That mud ain't worth the rope to hang him with." The crowd gathered around them, sensing entertainment. Thorn felt his cheeks burn with embarrassment as more laughter erupted. He'd become the fool of the market, the desperate man who'd bought a dying dog with his last coins. Copper seemed to sense the hostility, pressing closer to Thorn's leg with a low whimper. But then something strange happened. As Claymore continued his mocking speech about Thorn's poor judgment, Copper's demeanor shifted entirely. The dog's ears perked up, and he began sniffing the air with sudden intensity. His whole body went rigid, like a hunting dog catching the scent of prey. Thorn noticed the change immediately. This wasn't the listless, sickly animal from moments before. Copper's eyes had sharpened, and every muscle in his lean frame seemed coiled with purpose. The dog started pulling toward Claymore's wagon, whining with increasing urgency. "What's got into him?" Flynn muttered, still counting his coins. Copper broke free from Thorn's loose grip and bounded toward Claymore's expensive wagon. The crowd gasped as the dog began digging frantically at a specific spot beneath the wagon's floorboards, his claws scraping against wood with desperate determination. "Get that mangy beast away from my property," Claymore shouted, his face reddening with anger. But Copper wouldn't stop. He clawed and whined, pawing at the boards with such focus that even the laughing crowd fell silent. Something was hidden beneath that wagon, something that had triggered every instinct the dog possessed. And as Thorne watched his $5 investment tear apart Claymore's wagon with supernatural determination, he began to realize that maybe, just maybe, he hadn't made the worst decision of his life after all. Virgil Claymore's face had gone from red to pale white as Copper continued his frenzied digging beneath the wagon. The wealthy merchant grabbed a whip from his belt, raising it threateningly toward the dog. "I said get that animal away from there," he bellowed, but his voice carried a note of panic that hadn't been there before. Thorne stepped forward, his hand instinctively moving to Copper's collar, but something in the dog's behavior stopped him cold. This wasn't random destruction. Copper was digging with the precision of an animal that knew exactly what he was looking for. The crowd pressed closer, their earlier mockery replaced by curious whispers. Even Flynn had stopped counting his coins, watching the scene unfold with growing amazement. The dog's claws scraped against something hard beneath the wagon's floorboards, and the sound of metal against wood rang through the morning air. "That's enough!" Claymore stepped forward with his whip, but Copper had already found what he was searching for. With one final powerful swipe of his paws, a loose board gave way, revealing a hidden compartment beneath the wagon. What tumbled out made the entire crowd gasp in unison. Gold coins spilled onto the dusty ground, glinting in the sunlight like fallen stars. More than coins, though. There were jewelry pieces, silver pieces, and small leather pouches that clinked with the unmistakable sound of more precious metals. "Well, I'll be," Flynn whispered, his eyes wide with shock. Claymore lunged forward, trying to gather the scattered treasure. But the crowd had already seen too much. Murmurs rippled through the gathered merchants and buyers. Everyone knew that kind of wealth didn't belong hidden beneath a wagon floor. This was stolen goods, and Copper had just exposed one of the territory's most respected businessmen as a thief. "This is my property," Claymore shouted desperately, stuffing coins and jewelry back into the pouches. "That dog damaged my wagon. I demand compensation." But his protests fell on deaf ears. The crowd had seen the truth, and word was already spreading beyond the market square. Thorne watched in amazement as his $5 investment had just unmasked the biggest criminal in the territory. Copper sat calmly beside the scattered treasure, his tail wagging with satisfaction. Gone was the sickly, worthless animal from an hour ago. This dog had just demonstrated abilities that defied explanation. He hadn't just found hidden treasure by accident. He'd known exactly where to look. Sheriff Morton pushed through the crowd, his hand resting on his weapon as he surveyed the scene. His weathered face showed no surprise as he looked down at Claymore's exposed cash. "Virgil Claymore," he said slowly, "I believe we need to have ourselves a conversation about some missing gold shipments." As the sheriff began questioning Claymore, Thorne felt a hand on his shoulder. He turned to see Flynn staring at him with something approaching awe. "Friend," Flynn said quietly, "I think that dog of yours just did something that's going to change everything around here." But what neither man realized was that this was only the beginning of Copper's extraordinary talents. Sheriff Morton's questioning of Claymore revealed what everyone had long suspected, but could never prove. The wealthy merchant had been stealing from gold shipments for months, using his legitimate business as cover for his criminal activities. As Claymore was led away in shackles, the sheriff turned his attention to Thorne and the remarkable dog that had exposed everything. "That's quite an animal you got there," Morton said, crouching down to study Copper more closely. "How'd you know he could find hidden treasure?" Thorne shook his head, still stunned by the morning's events. "I didn't know anything, Sheriff. I just bought him because—" He paused, realizing how foolish the truth would sound. "Because something told me to." The sheriff nodded thoughtfully, then stood and dusted off his knees. "Well, son, there's something you should know about territorial law. When stolen goods are recovered through citizen assistance, there's a reward involved." Thorne's heart started beating faster. "A reward?" 20% of the recovered value, Morton explained. "Been the law for years, designed to encourage folks to help with justice." He gestured toward the pile of treasure that deputies were still cataloging. "Preliminary count shows about $15,000 in stolen goods." The mathematics hit Thorne like a lightning bolt. 20% of $15,000 meant $3,000, more money than he'd ever seen in his entire life. More than enough to save his ranch, pay his debts, and start over with a real chance at prosperity. Flynn let out a low whistle. Friend, you just went from broke to rich in the span of one morning. But as word of the reward spread through the market, Thorne noticed something troubling. Other merchants who had been laughing at him minutes earlier were now eyeing Copper with unmistakable greed. Their expressions had shifted from mockery to calculation, and he could practically see the schemes forming behind their eyes. "That's a valuable dog you got there, Shepherd," said one of the cattle dealers. "Might be interested in making an offer." "I'd pay good money for an animal like that," added another. "Real good money." More men began approaching, each throwing out increasingly ridiculous offers for Copper. The numbers climbed higher and higher as they realized what they'd witnessed wasn't luck. It was a genuine talent that could make any man wealthy beyond imagination. Thorne felt overwhelmed by the sudden attention. Hours ago, he'd been invisible in this market, just another failed rancher counting his last coins. Now he was the center of a bidding war over his newfound companion. Copper seemed to sense the changing mood. The dog pressed closer to Thorne's leg, his earlier confidence replaced by wariness as strangers reached toward him with grasping hands. A low growl rumbled in his throat as one man tried to pet him without permission. "The dog's not for sale," Thorne said firmly, surprising himself with the strength in his voice. "Everything's for sale for the right price," called out a voice from the crowd. "Name your number, Shepherd." The offers kept coming, each more tempting than the last. $500, $1,000. Some men were even offering partnerships, promising to split profits if Thorne would let them use Copper's abilities for their own treasure-hunting ventures. But as Thorne looked down at the dog that had just changed his life forever, he realized that some things couldn't be bought or sold. Copper had chosen him, not the other way around, and that bond meant more than any amount of money these men could offer. What none of them knew was that Copper's treasure-finding ability was just one small part of what made this dog truly extraordinary. The ride back to Thorne's ranch should have been the happiest journey of his life. $3,000 in reward money meant salvation from bankruptcy, but something gnawed at him as they traveled the dusty trail home. Word of Copper's abilities had spread faster than wildfire, and he couldn't shake the feeling that they were being followed. Copper trotted alongside his horse with renewed energy, no longer the sickly animal from the market. His coat seemed healthier already, and his alert eyes constantly scanned their surroundings. Every few minutes the dog would stop and sniff the air, his ears perked with concern. As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, they crested a hill that overlooked Thorne's modest ranch. What he saw below made his blood run cold. Strange horses were tied outside his house, and smoke rose from his chimney, smoke that he hadn't left burning when he departed for the market that morning. Copper immediately bristled, a low growl rumbling deep in his chest. The dog's instincts confirmed what Thorne already suspected. They had unwelcome visitors. Dismounting quietly, Thorne crept closer to his own home with Copper at his side. Through the window, he could see 3 men inside, going through his belongings with casual arrogance. They weren't ordinary thieves. These men wore expensive clothes and moved with the confidence of people who believed they owned whatever they touched. "Should be back soon," one of them was saying. "Man's gotta come home sometime, and when he does, we'll make him an offer he can't refuse." "And if he refuses anyway?" asked another voice. "Then we take the dog and leave him to explain it to whoever finds him." Thorne's hands clenched into fists. These men weren't just after Copper. They were willing to hurt, or worse, to get what they wanted. The treasure-hunting dog had made him rich, but it had also painted a target on both their backs. Copper seemed to understand the gravity of their situation. Without any prompting from Thorne, the dog began moving with purpose toward the barn. His behavior was deliberate, almost as if he had a plan. Inside the barn, Copper started digging again, but this time in a corner that Thorne had never paid attention to. The dog worked with the same focused intensity he'd shown at the market, his claws scraping against something hard beneath the hay-covered floor. "What are you doing, boy?" Thorne whispered. But Copper's digging revealed something that made Thorne's heart race. Buried beneath his own barn floor was an old metal box, corroded with age but still intact. Inside were documents, property deeds, mining claims, and legal papers that bore his father's name. His father had been more than just a struggling rancher. These papers showed mining rights to land that extended far beyond their small ranch, claims that could be worth a fortune if properly developed. His father had hidden these documents years ago, probably during some long-forgotten trouble, and had died before revealing their location. Copper had just uncovered the second treasure of the day, but this one belonged to Thorne by birthright. As footsteps approached the barn, Thorne realized their hiding time was over. The men from his house had discovered they were back, and now there would be a confrontation that would determine whether his newfound fortune would be a blessing or a curse. The barn door creaked open as 3 men stepped inside, their weapons drawn and ready. The leader was tall and scarred, with the cold eyes of someone who'd killed before. His companions flanked him like wolves, blocking any escape route Thorne might have considered. "Well, well," the scarred man said, his voice smooth and dangerous. "Thorne Shepherd, I presume. We've been waiting to have a conversation with you." Thorne stood slowly, keeping his hands visible while Copper positioned himself between them and the intruders. The dog's body was coiled like a spring, ready to strike if needed. "Don't recall inviting anyone to my property," Thorne replied, his voice steadier than he felt. The leader chuckled. "Name's Burke. We represent some business interests that are very interested in your dog's unique talents. We're prepared to make you a generous offer. The dog's not for sale." "Oh, I think you misunderstand," Burke said, stepping closer. "This isn't really a negotiation. See, word travels fast around these parts, and there are some very powerful people who want that animal. People who don't take no for an answer." One of Burke's men moved to circle around behind Thorne, but Copper's warning growl stopped him cold. The dog's lips pulled back to reveal sharp teeth, and something primal in his stance made even the armed men hesitate. "That's quite a guard dog you got there," Burke observed. "But 3 guns beat 1 dog every time." But what Burke didn't know was that Copper had been assessing the situation from the moment they'd entered. The dog had noticed something the men had missed in their arrogance: the barn's layout, the scattered tools, and most importantly, the old rope hanging from the loft that could bring down a pile of heavy farming equipment stored above. With lightning speed, Copper launched himself not at the men, but at the rope. His teeth clamped down on the thick cord just as Burke raised his weapon toward Thorne. The rope snapped under the dog's weight, and a cascade of metal tools, wooden planks, and heavy equipment crashed down between Thorne and his attackers. The barn filled with dust and confusion as the men scrambled to avoid the falling debris. Thorne grabbed the precious document box and dove behind a pile of hay bales just as gunshots rang out. Copper was already there, having anticipated exactly where his master would seek cover. "You can't hide forever, Shepherd," Burke shouted through the settling dust. "We know you're in here." But Copper wasn't done. The dog had memorized every inch of the barn during their brief time inside, and he knew something else the intruders didn't. There was a small gap in the back wall that led to an old root cellar. With gentle pressure from his nose, he guided Thorne toward the hidden escape route. They slipped through the narrow opening just as Burke's men began systematically searching the barn. From the safety of the underground cellar, Thorne could hear their frustrated voices as they realized their prey had vanished. "Boss, they ain't here," one of the men reported. "Then they got out somehow," Burke snarled. "Spread out and find them. Check every building, every hiding spot. They can't have gone far." Sitting in the darkness of the root cellar, Thorne marveled at Copper's intelligence. The dog hadn't just saved their lives, he'd demonstrated strategic thinking that went far beyond animal instinct. This wasn't just a treasure-hunting dog. This was a companion who could outthink armed men and turn any environment to their advantage. But as the sounds of the search grew closer, Thorne realized they couldn't hide forever. They needed a plan that would end this threat once and for all, and somehow, looking into Copper's intelligent eyes in the dim light, he suspected the dog already had one in mind. In the darkness of the root cellar, Copper began behaving strangely again. The dog moved to a specific corner and started pawing at the dirt with the same focused intensity he'd shown twice before. Thorne watched in amazement as his companion uncovered something that would change everything: a cache of dynamite his father had stored for clearing stumps, along with a long fuse line that ran up through the walls. The plan that formed in Thorne's mind was dangerous, but Copper seemed to understand it instinctively. The dog's eyes gleamed with intelligence as Thorne carefully prepared the charges, setting them at strategic points beneath the barn's main support beams. The fuse line would give them just enough time to reach safety while ensuring Burke and his men would be trapped inside when the explosion brought down the entire structure. They waited until the voices were directly overhead. Then Thorne lit the fuse. He and Copper slipped out through the back opening of the cellar and ran toward the distant tree line. Behind them, they could hear Burke shouting orders to his men, still searching frantically through the barn. The explosion lit up the evening sky like thunder. The entire barn collapsed in a spectacular crash of splintered wood and twisted metal. When the dust settled, Burke and his men were pinned beneath the debris, alive but thoroughly defeated. Their weapons were buried, their arrogance crushed along with their bones. Sheriff Morton arrived within the hour. Having heard the explosion from town, he found Burke's crew exactly where Thorne said they'd be, trapped under the barn ruins, confessing to everything in exchange for medical attention. It turned out Burke worked for a criminal syndicate that had been tracking treasure hunting opportunities across the territory. As the sheriff hauled away the would-be thieves, Thorne stood with Copper watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant oranges and purples. The dog sat calmly beside him, no longer the mangy, worthless animal from the morning market. Copper's coat had somehow regained its luster, his eyes bright with satisfaction. "You know, boy," Thorne said, scratching behind Copper's ears, "I'm starting to think you knew exactly what you were doing from the very beginning." The mining claims Copper had uncovered would make Thorne wealthy beyond his wildest dreams. The reward money would rebuild his ranch. But more than that, he'd found something priceless, a companion whose intelligence and loyalty defied explanation. Over the following months, word of Copper's abilities spread throughout the territory, but Thorne never sold his services to the highest bidder. Instead, he used the dog's talents to help honest folks find lost property and expose criminals hiding stolen goods. They became legends, the rancher and his extraordinary dog who could find treasure and truth with equal skill. Some said Copper was blessed by fortune itself. Others claimed he was just the smartest dog that ever lived. But Thorne knew the real truth. Sometimes the best investments come disguised as the worst decisions. And sometimes what everyone else sees as worthless turns out to be the most valuable thing in the world. Nobody had wanted to buy the mangy dog that morning at the livestock market. But Copper had chosen his owner just as carefully as Thorne had chosen him, and together they'd built a fortune that no amount of money could ever equal. If you enjoyed this story, click the video on your screen now to watch another unforgettable tale from the frontier, where courage and destiny collide in ways you never expected. Don't forget to subscribe and consider a super chat to help us keep bringing you more stories like these. Your support means everything to us.
Have you ever seen a wild bobcat look straight into the eyes of another creature as if asking for help? Not with a hiss or a swipe of claws, but with a stillness so deep it feels like the whole forest is holding its breath. Out there in the Colorado rain, a tiny bobcat kitten stood soaked to the bone, its fur plastered flat, its paws sunk into the mud. Somewhere beyond the trees, thunder rolled low, and the smell of wet earth hung heavy in the air. I've spent years watching wild animals, elk, eagles, even the shyest foxes, but what happened that afternoon didn't belong in any field guide. It was part mystery, part miracle, and part something that makes you believe all over again in the quiet bonds between living things. And it all began with a moment so small you could have missed it if you blinked. It began with movement, small, hesitant, almost hidden by the curtain of rain. At first, I thought it was nothing more than a branch swaying in the wind. But then it stepped forward. A wild bobcat kitten, no bigger than a house cat, emerged from the dripping undergrowth. Its paws sank into the sodden earth, and for a moment it just stood there, rain streaming down its whiskers. Then it lifted its head, not toward the trees, not toward safety, but toward a tall, dark shape just ahead. Dakota, a wild Mustang, stood still against the storm. She had been grazing near the edge of the clearing, her black mane plastered to her neck, her breath visible in the cold air. Normally, a bobcat in the wild keeps its distance from anything larger than itself, especially a horse. But this kitten, it walked forward. No crouch, no pounce, no threat, just a slow, deliberate approach, eyes locked on Dakota's. If you've spent enough time in the wild, you know when something's out of place. Predators and prey have invisible boundaries. They share the same forests and meadows, but they rarely meet without tension. And yet here was this kitten, soaked and shivering, crossing that invisible line as if it didn't exist. I've read about such moments before: wild dolphins pushing stranded dogs back to shore, crows bringing food to injured cats, but witnessing it yourself changes everything. You realize that sometimes survival pushes animals beyond instinct. Sometimes desperation writes new rules. The kitten stopped a few feet from Dakota and lifted one tiny paw, holding it close to its chest as if unsure of what to do next. It didn't mewl or cry out. The storm was too loud for sound to carry far, but its body spoke a language anyone could understand. Ears slightly back, head tilted, chest forward, it was the posture of asking. That was the moment I understood that communication isn't always about noise. It can be the tilt of a head, the slowing of a step, the choice to stand instead of run. Scientists call this cross-species signaling. And while it's documented in studies like the famous case of a gorilla gently returning a lost duckling, it's still rare enough to make you question what you think you know. Dakota didn't move at first. Her ears flicked once, twice, and her nostrils flared. Rainwater streamed down her muzzle, darkening the patch of white above her lip. She shifted her weight, not away from the kitten, but toward it, closing the space between them by a single step. In that step, a story began, one that would unfold in ways I couldn't have predicted. I thought about something an old wildlife tracker once told me in Wyoming. When animals do something that doesn't make sense, pay attention. That's where the truth hides. At that moment, I remembered another story, a recorded incident in Montana where a mule deer stayed beside an injured Canada goose until rescuers arrived. The deer had no reason to linger. There was no food, no benefit, and yet it stood guard for hours in the snow. Why, no one knows for certain, but the pattern is there. When the stakes are high enough, the instinct to help sometimes outweighs the instinct to survive. Watching Dakota and the kitten now, I felt that same quiet tension. This wasn't about curiosity. It wasn't about territory. It was about something else. Something I'd seen only a handful of times in all my years around wild animals. The storm around them didn't let up. Wind pressed the trees into deep boughs, and sheets of rain turned the clearing into a shallow pool. The kitten blinked up at Dakota, its fur slicked tight against its frame, making it look even smaller. I wondered how far it had come through the storm. Bobcat kittens rarely venture far from the den at this age. They rely on their mother for food, warmth, and protection from predators. Without her, their odds of survival drop sharply below 20% in the wild. And yet here it was, alone in the open. It made me think about the times in our own lives when we've been caught in storms, physical or otherwise, and had to choose between retreating into ourselves or stepping forward, hoping someone might understand what we needed. The difference for animals is that they can't explain it in words. They have to trust that the other will see the message in their posture, in their stillness. Dakota's next move was small but telling. She lowered her head until her muzzle was almost level with the kitten's. Not close enough to touch, just enough to show she wasn't a threat. In the language of prey animals, that's a monumental choice. Lowering your head makes you vulnerable. But she did it anyway. The kitten took a single step forward, then another, and in that fragile gap between them, the rain seemed to soften. Not stop, just soften. Maybe it was my imagination, or maybe it was the way the moment pulled the noise out of everything else. If you've ever been caught watching something so unexpected that you forget to breathe, you know the feeling. It's not about thinking your mind stops. You just watch, waiting for the next thread in the story to reveal itself. Here's the lesson I carried from that instant in both the wild and in our lives. The most important connections often begin without a sound. They start when one heart decides to close the distance, even when the rules say it shouldn't. It's easy to assume the wild is only about survival, about competition and dominance. But if you stay long enough, if you pay attention, you'll see moments that don't fit the narrative. Moments that suggest there's more beneath the surface, an undercurrent of choices that aren't driven by fear or gain, but by something quieter. And if that's true for them, maybe it's true for us too. That afternoon in the rain, as the kitten stood in front of Dakota, something unspoken passed between them. I didn't know yet where it would lead. I didn't know what dangers lay beyond the clearing. But I did know this: whatever happened next would carry both risk and meaning. And it would change how I looked at the wild forever. Because sometimes the cry you hear in the rain isn't meant for you. But you're still meant to witness what comes after. The storm was only just beginning, and neither the kitten nor Dakota knew that the path ahead would test more than strength. It would test the boundaries of what we believe about the wild itself. By the time Dakota shifted her weight toward the kitten, the air had changed. Not just wetter, not just colder, it had that sharp, charged feel that mountain storms carry, the kind that makes even the boldest animals pause before stepping out into the open. In the Rockies, storms aren't polite. They don't give you time to decide what to do. One moment the sky is a patchwork of blue and cloud. The next a wall of rain sweeps in blurring ridge lines and turning dry trails into rushing streams. For the animals who call these mountains home, every shift in wind is a signal. Birds cut their songs short. Deer move downhill. And bobcats, small, solitary, and fiercely independent, disappear into whatever cover they can find. That's the rule. Yet here was Rusty the bobcat kitten out in the open, ignoring every survival instinct written into his bones. The storm hadn't just arrived, it had been building for hours. You could feel it in the way the ground softened underfoot, in the deep rhythmic drumming on pine needles. I'd seen storms like this before, and I knew what they could do. They snap trees like matchsticks. They send rock slides tearing through canyons. And sometimes they trap animals in ways no one expects. Years ago, a wildlife rescue team in Washington shared footage of a young cougar pinned under a fallen cedar after a windstorm. No one knows how long she'd been there before hikers heard her faint cries. She survived, but only because someone happened to pass by. Out here, those chances are rare. Rusty's mother, Luna, wasn't anywhere in sight. That meant one of two things: she'd left to hunt and been delayed, or something had already happened to her. In either case, the storm made finding her harder with every passing minute. Bobcat kittens depend on their mothers for more than food. They learn how to hunt by watching her stalk rabbits in the grass, how to hide by following her into dense undergrowth. Without those lessons, even a healthy kitten has little chance of making it past its first year. The rain thickened, flattening the grass around Dakota's legs. She took a step back from the tree line, shaking her mane, scanning the ridge above, as if deciding whether to move on. That hesitation, that single moment, was the thin line between crossing paths with Rusty and never seeing him at all. Storms rearrange the wild in ways that feel random to us, but make perfect sense to the animals who live in it. A bobcat den that was safe yesterday might flood today. A trail used by elk might be washed out in a matter of hours. That constant change is why survival here isn't about being the strongest. It's about knowing when to move and when to stay still. And storms force those decisions faster than anything else. I thought of a time in Arizona's Mogollon Rim country where a sudden summer monsoon sent a wall of water through a normally dry creek bed. A mule deer doe caught on the far side chose to wade into the current rather than wait. She reached the bank shaking and exhausted, but with her fawn pressed to her side. The ranger who saw it later said she could have waited it out, but storms have their timelines. She moved because she had to. That's what I saw now in Rusty, not a reckless choice, but an urgent one. He wasn't in the clearing because he wanted to be. He was there because the storm had already erased the other options. And in that stripped-down moment, with only risk ahead and danger behind, he went toward the one thing that might help a creature far larger, far stronger, and in most cases far less forgiving of predators. That's the fresh perspective storms bring. They don't just threaten life, they rearrange alliances. They create moments where survival outweighs rivalry, where the rules bend because they have to. Interspecies cooperation is rare, but in extreme conditions it becomes more possible. Biologists studying post-wildfire ecosystems in California found deer and black bears drinking side by side at the same streams in the days after the fire. Not friends, not allies, just survivors using the same scarce resource without conflict. Storms and disasters level the playing field. They strip away the comfort of routine, forcing choices we wouldn't normally make. And sometimes those choices bring two very different lives into the same space for the same reason. I could see Dakota's ears turning toward the sound of water rushing somewhere beyond the ridge. For her, the storm meant slick ground, hidden holes, the possibility of a fall that could leave her lame. For Rusty, it meant cold hunger and the very real chance that his mother was already beyond help. The question was whether either of them knew just how quickly the next hour could change both their lives. That's the lesson I've learned watching storms from Alaska to New Mexico. Nature doesn't negotiate. It doesn't wait for you to be ready. The window to act is always smaller than you think, and the cost of waiting is always higher than you expect. Rusty's small body shivered once, and he glanced toward the slope leading deeper into the forest. Whatever had driven him out into the open was still out there. Dakota's head turned to follow his gaze, and for the first time she stepped toward him, without hesitation. The storm had built to its breaking point, and every creature in its path was already making choices they couldn't take back. What Rusty did next would lead them both into a situation that no one, not the kitten, not the Mustang, not even the human watching, could have predicted. Just beyond the ridge hidden by the curtain of rain lay the real reason Rusty had braved the clearing, and the moment Dakota's quiet strength would be put to the test. Rusty didn't run when Dakota closed the space between them. He held his ground in the rain, head tilted just enough to keep her in focus. His small paws sunk deep into the soft mud. The storm washed away the sense that might have told her who he was, what he wanted. And yet somehow, she stayed. Horses are prey animals. Their survival depends on detecting a threat before it's close enough to matter. Normally, even the outline of a bobcat, even one this small, would trigger a step back, a tightening of muscles, the readiness to flee. But Dakota's ears flicked forward, then back, reading him not as a danger, but as something else entirely. That's the thing about wild encounters. They begin long before bodies touch. They start with the smallest signals where the eyes go. How the weight shifts the space one chooses to keep or close. To a horse, a predator that crouches low is trouble. One that stands upright and still might just be curious. Rusty did neither. Instead, he lowered himself slightly, not in a hunter's crouch, but in what could almost be called a bow. Then he did something so deliberate it erased any thought of chance. He took 3 slow steps forward, stopped, and waited. It was as if he'd rehearsed the act. But the truth is simpler. Desperation sharpens communication. Animals in crisis strip their signals down to what can't be misunderstood. I once heard a story from a park ranger in Montana about a raven that landed near him, hopping in circles before flying a short distance, cawing, then returning. It repeated the pattern until he followed and found a young elk tangled in discarded fencing. The raven didn't know the man could help. It only knew it needed another set of eyes on what was wrong. Rusty's steps toward Dakota had that same urgency. He wasn't asking her to understand everything, just enough to follow. The lesson is simple but easy to forget. You don't have to speak someone's language to be heard. You only need to make the message impossible to ignore. Dakota took one more step toward him, lowering her head again. The rain ran off her forelock and dripped onto the ground between them. For a long moment, neither moved. And then Rusty turned not away, but toward the tree line and looked back over his shoulder. That glance was the bridge. In human terms, it was the equivalent of saying, "Come with me." Horses don't follow predators. It's against every survival rule they've inherited. But in rare moments, rules bend. Biologists have recorded cases of wild elephants following the distressed cries of other species, sometimes even intervening. One notable case from Kenya described an elephant leading a lost calf of a completely different species back toward a waterhole, staying close until it was safe. No one can explain exactly why, but those who saw it agreed there was no mistaking the intent. Dakota hesitated, hooves shifting in the mud, head turning briefly toward the ridge she'd been watching earlier. Then she stepped after Rusty. A fresh perspective struck me in that moment. When the cost of inaction is high enough, even the most deeply wired instincts can be overridden. For Dakota, following Rusty meant entering cover where visibility was low and footing uncertain conditions that could end badly for a prey animal. For Rusty, leading her meant trusting that something far bigger, far stronger, might choose to help instead of harm. The rain muted every sound except the occasional crack of branches overhead. Rusty paused at the edge of the clearing, waiting until Dakota's shadow reached him before slipping under the first low branch. She followed, head bobbing to avoid the reach of the needles. Watching them, I remembered a time in Alaska when a sled dog named Jasper had been seen guiding a search and rescue team toward a buried hiker. The dog had no direct bond with the person under the snow, but it recognized the urgency of the situation and acted anyway. The team later said they had been minutes away from turning back. That hiker survived because an animal chose to lead. That's what Rusty was doing now, leading, not fleeing. Step by step he moved through the undergrowth, pausing only to check if Dakota was still behind him. Each glance back was a reassurance, each forward motion a commitment. It's easy to see these moments as instinct, but there's more to it. Researchers studying cross-species interactions note that in cooperative moments, animals will often adjust their pace to match the other, an intentional act to keep the connection. That's exactly what Rusty did, slowing on uneven ground, so Dakota could keep up. The further they went, the denser the cover became. Rain collected on the leaves overhead, dropping in cold bursts down their necks. Dakota's ears kept swiveling, catching every sound, twigs snapping under her hooves, the low creak of a branch shifting. Rusty didn't flinch at the noises. His focus stayed ahead where the shadows thickened. The small lesson I took from watching them was this: sometimes the only way to get help is to move toward it, even if it means leading someone into the very heart of your fear. Many animals and many people freeze when danger rises. But every so often, one takes the risk of pulling another into their problem, hoping that together they'll find a way through. As they reached a narrow path choked with wet ferns, Rusty stopped. His tail flicked once. Dakota halted behind him, ears tilting forward. The kitten looked back one last time, his gaze steady, then slipped through the ferns. From where I stood, I couldn't see what lay beyond, but I could feel it. The air seemed to hold a weight, the kind that comes before a reveal. The forest was quiet except for the rain, and in that quiet was the promise that something more waited ahead. I've learned that in stories like this, the moment just before the reveal is when everything balances trust, risk, and the possibility that it might not end well. For Dakota, following any further meant full commitment. For Rusty, this was the point of no return. He was either leading her toward hope or toward the kind of loss that stays. And then beyond the wall of ferns, the reason for Rusty's silent plea came into view, and it was worse than I could have imagined. When Dakota pushed her way through the wet ferns, the ground opened into a narrow hollow. The rain pooled there, running in small streams between roots. Rusty darted forward and stopped beside a long, dark shape stretched against the earth. It took me a moment to understand what I was seeing. A ponderosa pine, thick, heavy, and rain-soaked, had fallen across the hollow. The trunk pinned something beneath it. A paw, then the outline of a spotted flank. Luna. Her sides moved in short, shallow bursts. Her head lifted slightly when Dakota appeared, but she didn't growl, didn't bare her teeth. She just looked. Bobcats don't show weakness if they can help it. In the wild, any sign of injury invites danger. Yet here was a mother lying still under the weight of a tree, letting a horse and a human stand within sight. That alone told me how desperate this moment was. I'd seen storm damage like this before. A wet tree can weigh thousands of pounds, and when it falls, it doesn't have to hit with speed to cause damage. Its sheer mass can crush whatever is beneath. Years ago in Oregon, rescuers found a black bear cub pinned under a fallen cedar after a landslide. The cub had survived because its body was wedged into a small depression in the earth, sparing its ribs. Without that small bit of luck, it would have been over in seconds. For Luna, there was no such shelter. The tree had landed square across her hindquarters. Rusty pressed his small body against her face, nudging her cheek before stepping back toward Dakota again. He was repeating the same signal I'd seen in the clearing, showing, then asking. The rain kept falling, each drop darkening the fur along Luna's spine. She shifted once, a shallow movement, then stilled again. Bobcat mothers are fiercely protective. Their survival is tied directly to their kittens. Without her, Rusty would face cold starvation and predators within days. Studies show that orphaned bobcat kittens under 5 months rarely survive in the wild without human intervention. That's the math. Rusty didn't know, but was already living the kind of instinct that tells you when the stakes are final. Dakota took a step closer, her hooves sinking into the soft soil. Horses can be unpredictable around trapped animals. Fear of sudden movement or scent often keeps them away. But here Dakota lowered her head, nostrils flaring toward Luna. She held that posture for several seconds. In that stillness, there was an unspoken exchange, one that had nothing to do with dominance or territory. It was recognition. I thought of a time in Yellowstone when a herd of bison surrounded a wolf pup caught in a narrow crevice. They didn't try to harm it. They just stood watching, as if guarding it until the rest of the wolf pack arrived. Rangers who saw it said they couldn't explain why, only that it was deliberate. That's the fresh perspective moments like this offer. Sometimes the wild operates outside our human categories of predator and prey. Sometimes an animal doesn't see an enemy. It sees a life in need. The lesson I carried watching Dakota and Luna was simple. Help can come from where you least expect it, but only if you stay open to it. Luna's breathing was shallow. Each rise and fall of her chest seemed to cost her energy she didn't have. Rusty stepped over her front leg and pressed himself against her neck the way kittens do when they're cold or frightened. The rain made his fur stick to her like a second skin. He glanced back at Dakota, and for the first time his tail twitched a small, impatient flick, as if to say, "Do something." That flick seemed to break whatever hesitation Dakota had been holding. She shifted her stance, testing the ground hooves, finding the firmest patches in the soaked soil. This was not without risk. A trapped bobcat might lash out. A wrong step could sink her leg into a hole hidden by leaves. But Dakota stayed. In that moment, I was reminded of an incident in Colorado where a wild mare had been seen pulling at a top tangled around a young elk's antlers. No one knew how she'd learned to grip and tug without panicking, but she kept at it until the elk was free. It was filmed, and even seasoned wildlife experts admitted they'd never seen anything like it. We tend to think of intelligence in the wild as purely functional. Find food, avoid danger, raise young. But these moments suggest something more, something that looks a lot like choice. Rusty moved back, giving Dakota space. His ears were forward, his eyes locked on her. Luna shifted again, a low, almost inaudible sound escaping her throat. It wasn't a growl. It was closer to a sigh and acknowledgement. Maybe she knew she couldn't get out on her own. Maybe she recognized the odd alliance forming in the rain. Either way, the scene was set: a wild horse, a trapped predator, and a kitten who'd refused to give up. The question was what would happen next, and whether Dakota could or would act. The rain didn't stop, and neither did the clock ticking down on Luna's strength. The next choice Dakota made would decide whether this was the end of the story, or the beginning of something no one could have imagined. Dakota stood over the fallen pine, rain dripping from her main eyes fixed on Luna. She didn't move right away. Horses think in moments, not minutes. Each choice weighed against risk. Instinct and what they've learned from the land. Right now, everything in Dakota's bloodline told her to step back. Bobcats are predators. Trapped or not, they can strike if they feel cornered. And the ground under her hooves was slick, one wrong step from a fall. But then there was Rusty. He paced once around his mother's head, stopping each time to look at Dakota. No sound, no cry, just the same urgent stillness that had carried him from the clearing to this hollow. That's when Dakota shifted her weight forward. Not in a charge, not an alarm, just a careful step closer. If you've spent time around horses, you know this is where body language matters most. A horse will never approach a threat head-on without some signal that it's safe. What was that signal here? Maybe it was Luna's lack of aggression, maybe it was the kitten's proximity, or maybe it was something we can't measure in awareness we haven't yet put into words. I once read about a case in Botswana where an elephant approached a snare-trapped antelope. The antelope froze too exhausted to run. The elephant used its trunk to lift and break part of the snare, then walked away. No food gain, no herd nearby to benefit. Just an act that didn't fit into the survival-first rulebook. Watching Dakota now, I thought about that elephant. Both faced the same equation: risk to self versus aid to another. And both seemed willing to take the first step into uncertainty. The fresh perspective here is this: help in the wild is rarely accidental. It may be instinct at its root, but it's instinct shaped by experience, tempered by the moment. Dakota moved to the side of the trunk where the slope gave her better footing. She lowered her head and tested the bark with her muzzle, brushing it once, then pulling back. Horses use their lips and whiskers to read the world. This was her way of mapping what lay ahead. Rusty stayed pressed to Luna's shoulder, tail flicking in quick bursts. Luna's breathing was uneven, each exhale clouding the rain between them. She didn't pull away when Dakota's nose came close, another choice that mattered. I've learned that in animal rescues, cooperation isn't just about the rescuer's will, it's about the one in need, allowing the help. In Montana, a ranger once told me about freeing a golden eagle from barbed wire. The bird didn't thrash. It went still as if saving its energy for the moment the wire loosened. That stillness made the rescue possible. Luna was giving Dakota that same gift space to act without fear of retaliation. Dakota shifted again, planting her front hooves square. She pushed once at the trunk with her chest. Nothing. The tree didn't budge. She stepped back, angled her body, and pressed her shoulder into the wood. This time it rolled slightly, just enough to send a run of water trickling underneath. The sound made Rusty's ears snap forward. Luna tried to move, but her legs stayed pinned. That's when Dakota stopped pressing. She turned her head towards the steeper side of the slope, testing the ground with her back hoof. She was thinking, or what we might call thinking. In truth, it was assessment, finding the line between what she could lift and what might send her sliding into the hollow. The small lesson here is that strength without strategy often fails. In the wild, an animal doesn't throw itself at a problem without first reading the terrain. We could learn something from that, how to pause just long enough to see the safer way forward. Dakota moved again, this time placing her front hooves higher on the slope. She braced, lowered her neck, and hooked the underside of the trunk with her shoulder and chest. Her muscles tightened her legs, pushing against the mud. Slowly, the tree shifted another inch. It wasn't much, but in rescues, an inch can be everything. I thought again of the elephant and the antelope of a video I'd once seen of a sea otter pushing an injured pup onto a kelp raft to keep it afloat until help came. Across species, the pattern repeats: first contact, small adjustments, then the act itself. Rusty's eyes never left Dakota. He stepped back just enough to give her more room, a tiny act of trust. Luna's paw twitched as the pressure eased slightly. That was enough to make Dakota try again. She dug in, muscles rippling, and pushed. This time the trunk rolled far enough for Luna to pull her leg free with a wet, sucking sound from the mud. Dakota stepped back immediately, ears forward, watching. She didn't crowd them, didn't move closer. She just waited. It's moments like this that challenge the way we frame wild animals. We talk about instinct, like it's a single fixed program. But what I saw in Dakota was more than instinct. It was choice. Shaped by the moment, a willingness to stand inside another creature's crisis and risk something of her own. That's not just survival. That's compassion in whatever form it takes in the wild. Luna lay still for a moment, sides heaving, rain washing the mud from her fur. Rusty pressed against her, licking her face, his tiny body vibrating with relief. Dakota turned her head toward the ridge, then back to them, then took one slow step away from the hollow. She had done what she came to do, even if she hadn't planned it. Luna was free, but freedom didn't guarantee safety. What came next would decide if she could stand, if she could move, and if Rusty's choice to seek help had truly saved them both. The moment the weight came off, Luna tried to move. Her paw slipped in the mud, her claws digging for purchase. She let out a low, broken sound, half growl, half gasp, and dropped her head back to the ground. Rusty circled her, once, then stood still, his ears twitching in the rain. He was waiting to see if this was the moment his mother would rise, or not. Dakota stayed above them on the slope sides, heaving mud streaked along her shoulder where she'd pushed the trunk. She didn't move closer, but her head stayed low, eyes locked on Luna. In the wild, this is the point where the story can turn either way. Freedom from the trap doesn't mean survival. An injury, shock, or even hypothermia can still end it minutes later. Years ago in British Columbia, I heard about a young moose pulled from an icy pond by local firefighters. It had been trapped for only a short time, but once free, it couldn't stand. The cold had drained its strength so completely that even rescue wasn't enough. They spent another hour warming it with blankets and body heat before it finally managed to rise. That memory sat heavy now. Luna lay still, her breath shallow but steady. Rusty pressed himself against her side, licking at the wet fur on her neck. The kitten's small body shook not from the cold alone, but from the effort of holding on through fear. In moments like this, the wild feels less like a battlefield and more like a balance beam. One wrong shift in the life you've just fought for can tip away. The small lesson here, rescue is not a finish line. It's an opening. The work begins after the obstacle is moved. Dakota seemed to understand that. She stepped slowly down into the hollow, each hoof placed with care. She stopped just short of Luna, lowering her muzzle toward the mud near her paw. It wasn't a push or a prod, more like a check the way a horse will nudge another to see if they're alert. Luna's eyes blinked slowly. She turned her head just enough to meet Dakota's gaze. That's when I noticed it, her front legs shifting slightly, pressing into the ground as if testing them. Rusty stepped back, giving her space. She tried again, pushing up through her chest. This time her body rose a few inches before her hind leg buckled. She went down hard, her chin hitting the mud. The sound made Dakota lift her head sharply, ears forward. In a different situation, this would be the moment for retreat. Too much noise, too much movement. But instead, Dakota stayed. That choice reminded me of a story from Alaska's Kenai Peninsula, where a pair of wild musk ox stood guard over a fallen calf for hours, fending off foxes and gulls until it could rise. It wasn't their calf, they'd been part of a merged herd after a storm, but they held the ground anyway. Acts like that suggest a fresh perspective. Sometimes protection isn't about kinship. It's about recognizing vulnerability and choosing to stand with it until the danger passes. Luna tried a third time. Her front legs held her body trembling as she shifted weight to her hindquarters. This time, the injured leg dragged, but didn't collapse entirely. She took one short, awkward step. Rusty moved with her weaving in front as if guiding her toward the clearer ground at the edge of the hollow. Each movement was careful, deliberate. Her body language said she wasn't sure she could keep going, but she was trying. That's a moment anyone can learn from, whether in the wild or our own lives. The first step after pain is rarely graceful. It's enough just to take it. Dakota backed up the slope, clearing the space for them to follow. She didn't turn away, didn't leave, just gave them the path. Luna limped forward, slow and uneven, with Rusty pressed to her uninjured side. Every few steps she paused to breathe, ears flicking at the rain. The distance between them and the fallen tree grew. The risk of another collapse lessened, and still Dakota waited. When they finally reached the slope, Luna stopped. She looked back toward the hollow, then toward Dakota. It wasn't a long stare, but it held. There was no roar, no snarl, just an unspoken exchange. She blinked once, then turned away, disappearing with Rusty into the thick cover beyond. Dakota remained at the ridge for a moment longer. Her tail swished once, then she stepped into the rain, moving toward the open meadow. Watching her go, I thought about the patterns we expect from the wild, the fixed roles of predator and prey, the idea that lines can't be crossed. And yet here was proof in hoof prints and paw prints side by side in the mud, that the rules are not unbreakable. The rescue was done, but the memory of it would stay long after the rain stopped. Luna was walking again, but the storm hadn't passed. The forest still held its dangers, and the hours ahead would decide whether Rusty's gamble truly changed their fate or only bought them a little more time. Luna and Rusty moved slowly through the undergrowth, her limp noticeable but steady. The rain had softened, falling in lighter sheets now, and each drop seemed to quiet the forest rather than stir it. Dakota followed at a distance, not pressing them, but not turning away either. She moved like a shadow there, if needed, invisible if not. In the wild, this is often the most fragile stage of survival. The danger that trapped you may be gone, but weakness draws its risks. Injured predators are more vulnerable to scavengers, rivals, or even the elements themselves. Years ago in Maine, a tagged female bobcat was struck by a falling branch during an ice storm. Wildlife biologists monitored her for weeks. She survived not by hunting as before, but by staying close to sheltered ridges and feeding on what small prey she could catch without running far. They said it wasn't her strength that saved her, it was her ability to adjust. Luna seemed to understand this already. She didn't push for speed. Every step was measured, her eyes scanning not for prey, but for safety. Rusty stayed at her side, occasionally brushing against her leg as if to anchor her pace. That simple act, staying close without rushing, was its kind of protection. The lesson here is subtle. After a rescue, the next victory isn't in how fast you recover, but in how you move forward without reopening the wound. Dakota's presence added another layer to this moment. Most wild horses would have turned away by now, returning to their herd or moving on to higher ground as the storm eased. But she lingered. She kept them within sight until Luna stepped into a patch of denser cover where a fallen log and thick shrubs formed a natural shelter. Only then did Dakota stop. She stood at the edge of the clearing, watching. It reminded me of something I once witnessed in Wyoming, a pronghorn antelope pausing at the ridge after leading her fawn to a hidden meadow. She didn't enter the meadow herself. She stayed just long enough to be sure her young had reached safety before turning away. That's the fresh perspective moments like this offer. Care doesn't always mean staying forever. Sometimes it means stepping back the moment the other is strong enough to stand alone. Rusty disappeared into the shelter with Luna, his spotted coat blending into the mottled light. Dakota waited a heartbeat longer, her ears flicking toward the sound of their movement. Then with a slow turn, she began walking toward the meadow beyond. Her tail swayed once, then twice, before the rain swallowed her shape. It struck me that this quiet departure might be the most powerful part of the story. Not the push against the tree, not the moment Luna stood, but the choice to leave without claiming anything in return. We often imagine wild acts of help as grand gestures, but the truth is their strength lies in their lack of demand. The animals don't wait for thanks. They simply return to the path they were on, changed only in the way they carry the memory. I thought again of the hoof prints and paw prints in the mud back at the hollow. In time, the rain would erase them, but in the minds of those who saw them, and perhaps in the instincts of those who lived them, they would leave a trace far deeper than the soil. That's the small lesson here. Not all impacts are visible, and not all connections are meant to last in the open. Some live on in the quiet choices made after. The forest settled into its post-storm rhythm. Birds began calling again, and the rush of water softened to a steady trickle. Somewhere beyond the ridge, Dakota's hoofbeats faded. In the shelter, Luna shifted her weight, curling slightly so Rusty could tuck himself into the curve of her body. She began grooming him, short, deliberate strokes of her tongue, smoothing the wet fur along his spine. He leaned into it, purring low and steady. They had survived the storm, the fallen tree, and the uncertainty of those long minutes under its weight. They had done it because Rusty had gone against every instinct to seek help, and because Dakota had chosen to answer that plea instead of turning away. I've seen rescues where the aftermath is chaos. Animals scattering injuries, worsening the tension of survival, pushing every instinct back into high alert. This was different. This was stillness. It was a moment where everyone involved seemed to understand the role they'd played and that it was enough. That stillness is rare both in the wild and in our own lives. We tend to rush from crisis to crisis, barely pausing to see what's changed. But if you watch the way animals handle these moments, you learn something. Once the danger passes. They stop, they rest. They let the relief exist for as long as it lasts. That's the perspective worth carrying home from this hollow, that sometimes the best way to honor what's been given to you is simply to be still with it. The rain continued to fall light and steady, soaking into the forest floor. Somewhere out there, Dakota was already fading back into the life she knew before this day. Luna and Rusty were hidden safe for now. The balance of the wild would go on the lines between predator and prey, redrawn just enough to leave room for what had happened here. The storm's end marked more than safety, it marked a choice. And the meaning of that choice would echo far beyond this forest, carrying a message about coexistence, compassion, and the fragile ties that bind us to the lives we share this land with. Long after Dakota's hoofbeats faded, the image of her standing over Luna stayed with me. Not just because of the rescue itself, but because of what it said about the way life in the wild sometimes bends its own rules. We expect predator and prey to be locked in a permanent standoff, each defined only by how they survive. But in that hollow, with the rain pressing down and the clock running out, those roles didn't matter. What mattered was a choice to step toward another life instead of away from it. In all my years watching wild animals, I've learned that survival stories aren't always about who's the fastest or the strongest. Sometimes they're about who notices the small signals, who answers the silent plea. Rusty's decision to leave cover and approach Dakota defied his instincts. Dakota's decision to follow him into danger defied hers. Together, those choices rewrote what could have been just another loss in the storm into something worth remembering. We see this pattern in other corners of the natural world. In Florida, there was the manatee that swam beside a disoriented dolphin, guiding it away from shallow water. In Montana, a herd of elk surrounded an injured foal from another species until it could stand again. These moments are rare, but they share one thing: they happen because someone, animal or human, chose to see beyond themselves. That's the fresh perspective this story offers. Compassion doesn't erase the wildness of the world, but it threads through it in ways we often overlook. For Luna and Rusty, the outcome was simple: they were alive. For Dakota, there was no obvious reward. She didn't gain food or territory. She just went back to her life carrying a memory only she can truly measure. For us, the lesson is broader. We're part of this same web of choices. Every day, in ways big and small, we decide what we will protect and what we will ignore. Maybe it's pausing to move a turtle off a busy road. Maybe it's donating to a wildlife rescue when you could have spent that money on yourself. Maybe it's leaving part of your yard wild so native birds have a safe place to feed. These acts don't make headlines, but they shape the kind of world we pass on. And here's something worth knowing: bobcats like Luna are still under pressure across much of the United States. Habitat loss, vehicle strikes, and dwindling prey in some regions mean that even healthy populations face risks. Wildlife rescue groups, many run on donations and volunteer hours, are often the last safety net for animals caught in storms, hit by cars, or orphaned too soon. If Rusty had been just a little younger and Luna unable to move, their only hope might have been human intervention. That's why supporting these efforts matters. Not because every story will end with a wild horse and a bobcat walking away together, but because every life given a second chance changes the balance for the better. Think about the footprints left in the mud that day, hoof prints and paw prints side by side. The rain will erase them, but the fact that they were ever there, that's permanent. It's proof that even in the raw, unsentimental reality of the wild, there is room for moments that serve no purpose except to keep another heart beating. And maybe that's the point. The value of a life isn't measured by whether it benefits us, it's measured by whether it has the chance to continue. So here's my question to you. What will you choose to protect? Will you notice the small signals? Will you answer the silent pleas even when there's no reward waiting for you? I hope the next time you're faced with that choice, whether it's in the wild, in your community, or your own home, you'll remember Rusty, Luna, and Dakota. Remember that storms don't just test strength, they test compassion. And sometimes answering that test is the most important thing we can do. If this story moved you, take a moment to reflect on the choices you've made to protect life, any life, and the ones you still want to make. Then, help keep stories like this alive. Like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who could use a reminder that the world is still full of quiet acts of courage. Because what we choose to protect says everything about who we are.